Good morning, everyone. Welcome at this webinar, this Orange webinar on cybersecurity and risk identification. I'm here today with two experts. I have Audrey Balen here in my bubble. Audrey is a solution architect security at Orange. And joining us via Skype call today is Thomas Leclerc. So unfortunately, due to the COVID measures, he could not be here live, but we made a hybrid setting and Thomas is joining us via Skype call. I am Koen van Ikkepoel. I'm a marketing manager at Orange, and I'll be your host today. As you know, cybersecurity or cyber threats are on the rise, and so for everybody, for every IT professional, it's important to have cybersecurity in their main objectives. Today, we would like to give you some elements that can help you in fighting this challenge. On the agenda for today, I will give a brief introduction, and then we will see the importance of data as a decisive business enabler. Secondly, we will go to some figures on cybercrime. We have seen on the Orange network the evolution of cybercrime, and Audrey will give you all the details on this. And then we go much more into detail on risk identification in your IT security strategy. And finally, we will make it very concrete and we'll see how this risk identification exercise accords to the maturity of your security strategy in your company. So let me just introduce the team. And introducing cybersecurity, it goes with the introduction of the deep web. So the deep web is a place where web pages are not indexed. So you cannot find them via, for instance, a Google search. The deep web is 500 times as big as the surface web, so the web that you can browse using a search engine like Google. If you know that there are 130,000 billion pages indexed on Google, you can multiply that by 500 and you have an idea of the size of the deep web. Part of the deep web is the dark web. The dark web is a place where you can surf without being noticed, with being anonymous and not leaving any traces. Here on the slide, you see some examples of transactions that can be done on the dark web. So you can see that you can buy a passport for Belgium for, I think it's 500 euros. And if you throw in an extra 100 euros, you also have a driving license. Something else that you can maybe search for is the login details for the Twitter account of Donald Trump. I think it will cost a little bit more, but you can have a serious impact on the upcoming elections, I think. So we see that cyber threat is increasing very quickly. By the end of 2021, the total value, you could say, or the total cost of cybercrime will rise up to $6 trillion. That is more than the combined traffic, the value of the combined traffic of all illegal drugs in the world. So if you are considering changing your career towards drug trafficker, you might reconsider and focus a little bit more on cybercrime. Now, why are companies that are fairly innocent, you could say, why are they targeted by cybercrime? Well, the answer is data. Data is, on the one hand, strategic. It's very valuable for companies, but on the other hand, it also makes them vulnerable, especially in this digital age. Cyber criminals, they are interested in that data because they can steal it, and for instance, bank account details can enable the cyber criminals, can enable them to steal money from individuals, from clients of these companies. They can also ransom the data, so they can block the company and ask for a ransomware. Or a ransom, or for instance, they can spy for competition, for competitors. Data is key, and at Orange we see that this whole data sphere is evolving. Back in 2015, 70% of the worldwide data was generated by consumers, 30% by enterprises. If we look 10 years further, up to 2025, we see that this is about to shift. companies are becoming much more active in the generation of data. So they will be worth 60% of the total amount of data that will be generated. A second trend is the explosion of the amount of data that will be generated. It will be a factor 10, so up to 163 zettabytes of data that will be generated by 2025. If you know that 1 zettabyte is a trillion gigabyte, you know that this is massive. Now, why is this data exploding? Well, here comes our big friend 5G. So 5G is the next generation of mobile networks, and it will help enterprises in generating a lot more data. 5G, and especially the combination of 5G and IoT, will create a lot of new use cases in healthcare, in industry. For instance, in Industry 4.0, measuring the whole supply chain with smart devices, it will generate an enormous amount of data. So it's quite clear that data is something that is of strategic value for every company in the world. Let's see how data what is the position of data in the corporate environment. And I give the floor to Thomas, who hopefully can join us smoothly via the Skype connection. Hi, Thomas.
Hi, Koen. Thank you for the introduction. So I will try to give a bit of perspective on the way data can help business to create value, because it's sometimes a bit subjective. So as part of the Orange Group, we have some practices that are specializing in data intelligence, and they structure the business according to 4 categories that data can help for your business. The first one is to do new business. New business can consist of detecting and choosing to develop new service based on data. According to a survey that is highlighting that 86% of businesses say that they could create more value through the deployment of data analysis. We have a very concrete example at Orange Belgium from a partnership we had with Peridisa. We helped them to make the traffic jam to join their location much more smooth by providing them some data about the location of people that are joining on the highway, and this allowed them to offer a new service to their client by providing some alternative routes to avoid the traffic jam. The second category is to do better. Do better is mainly consisting of optimizing the operational efficiency via, for example, the deployment of KPI and the real-time monitoring of those KPI to measure the performance. And according to a Gartner survey, artificial intelligence deployment will help to improve efficiency and create $2.9 trillion business value by 2021. The third category is to do right. And do right consists in anticipating some risk, for example, fraud, security risk, regulatory risk. And there is a survey also published by Ernst & Young that is stating that 72% of businesses believe big data can play a vital role in detecting fraud. In the field of security, we can also observe some trends that are related to this, that can consist, for example, of using data to perform some threat intelligence to prevent incidents. And the last category is to do more, and do more is mainly focusing on customer experience. If we take the example, for example, of online business, we can consider, for example, the conversion rate, the customer journey on a website, and that is supposed to help companies to better understand their clients and better serve them. Gartner estimates that 80% of the firms will compete on customer experience, but only half of them will really understand how the customer feels. So data is also critical to understand your clients. If we go on the following slides, we see also a framework that has been defined by McKinsey. I will go quick on this one, that categorize the way that data can create value for your business according to 3 categories. Top line use case, that is really focusing on customer-facing activities. The bottom line use case, that is mainly focusing on internal processes optimization. And the third one is new business model that can create new opportunity for your business thanks to data. It's important also for you to know that what's valid for enterprises is also valid for cyber criminals. It's important also to consider that the way you can leverage and value your business thanks to data is the same for cyber criminals. So that's a critical element. And when we go on the next slide, we see that to leverage on data, you will need to have some solid foundation to leverage on those data. Two types of foundations. The first one is the technical foundations, which is made of data, analytics, and IT. And the second one is the business foundations. According to McKinsey, you will not be able to leverage and to capitalize on the potential of data if you have some weak links as part of this value chain. What does it mean? It means that if you have a weak link, such as, for example, data security as part of this value chain, you will never be able to leverage on the total potential represented by data. So that's what we will focus on today, is the way you can make sure your data security is sufficiently performing for you to be able to have a good data usage and to leverage on the business potential it brings. As part of Orange, we are really convinced about the importance of cybersecurity and IT security, and this is why we position it as a transversal business line supporting all the rest of our activities, which are the collection of data, the transport of data, the storage and the process of data, analyzing, sharing, and creating data. All those activities are supported in a transversal way by the cybersecurity, which consists first on the core network security, for example, the mobile network, the fixed network, securing this network. But on top of it, we can also bring some additional layers that can be either the security solutions that you can also subscribe as a user to reinforce your security. I can take the example of on-premise firewall, for example. We can also bring some advisory and consulting services. And last but not least, we can also bring some service management to support you in your daily task and monitoring of your security infrastructure. So that's the way we integrate security as part of the Orange portfolio strategy. I hope it was clear.
Yes, thanks a lot, Thomas. I see that the connection via Skype goes very well. So I think you have a very qualitative connection over there. What I forgot to mention in the introduction, if you have questions during our presentation, don't hesitate to ask them via the chat. Afterwards, I will moderate these questions and the experts can give their view on your individual challenges. So Thomas gave us an overview of the importance of data in the corporate environment. That data is also at threat, so cybercrime is evolving, and Aubrey will share his thoughts on this.
Thank you, Koen. Now, first of all, it's very important to not underestimate the capacity of cybercriminals to innovate. We can see that this innovation capacity is usually driven by a couple of main characteristics. One is monetization. Europol actually launched a report last year where they see that monetization is actually mainly happening to a couple of techniques. One of them is obviously ransomware. This still remains one of the largest threats observed by the Europol investigators. And while we see a decline in the amount of successful ransomware attacks, we can still see that the monetization is actually increasing at this point. The second one, and the second prominent one, is the compromise of data. This is mostly financial data, but this also can be credit card information, online banking account, Bitcoin wallets, which can be used either for direct sales or attempts of fraud. Now, personal data is often used for using account takeovers, and as a result, CEO fraud, phishing attempts, spear phishing, and things like that. Last of all, Europol recently also observed the growth of what we call malicious insider activity, or rogue employees, directed to them either internally or perhaps from the supply chain, which can be a supplier or another vendor or another customer. Now, some threats can lead to monetization to a smaller extent, which can, for example, be a denial of service attack. The result is something that exists called malware as a service. And we also see that crypto mining has become very popular, where the public cloud has become a main target to do that. Now, also, the criminals are developing new tools and techniques, and where we can see they are actually sponsored or get investments from nations. This actually leads them or allows them to generate tools on a very larger scale to even attack geographic targets. Basically, the internet has become the new battleground, and we can see that casualties are happening at both consumers and also organizations that are using the World Wide Web. Now, a third technology evolution that we see is where the cyber criminals are actually following the industry trends. Global digitalization has resulted that many organizations are shifting what we call the perimeter to the cloud or to branch offices. And that's actually the point where we often focus our security on. Bringing the perimeter to different locations actually enlarges the risk and the vulnerabilities that it brings with them. The cyber criminals will actually try to abuse that with all the consequences. Now, it's still the technology layer where we can have the most control and where we can actually deploy solutions using the best practices and actually have them managed by skilled and expertised engineers. Now, also, the threat landscape is evolving, and where we see that the cyber criminals are changing their approach in a couple of domains. One of them is the evolving targets. Information theft is the most expensive and fastest rising consequence of cybercrime for companies. But data is not the only target. Core systems such as industrial controls, devices are also being hacked and can result in a very dangerous trend in disruption and destroyed devices. We've seen some examples of that in industrial organizations like ASCO and, for example, Picanol as well. These kinds of attacks will obviously disrupt the business, and the impact can vary in a very large scale. Now, also the impact is evolving. Data theft is the primary target, but it's not always the main outcome. Modern cyber attacks see data no longer simply being copied or stolen, but sometimes the data is simply destroyed or modified. This can actually breed distrust within companies. It can also cause a safety hazard, as, for example, we see an increase in malware attacks towards government organizations, industrial companies, but also healthcare organizations like hospitals. I believe last week we actually got a confirmed casualty as a result of a ransomware attack. The techniques are evolving as well. Cyber criminals are adapting their attack methods, where hacking a perimeter is a very cumbersome objective. It might be more easier to target the weakest link at an organization, which is, of course, still the human employee. We see a very large increase in the amount of phishing attacks and social engineering. It's actually very easy for an attack to do enough research online by checking social media, like LinkedIn, for example, and identifying which targets you actually want to approach within a certain company. Now, this is actually the nature of the threat that is very rapidly changing, so we need to reshape actually our threat models as well. Another great example of where we see that cyber criminality is evolving is where they try to follow also the current affairs. Now, these graphs have nothing to do with corona infections, although they're slightly related to them. These are actually the amount of increased attacks and port scans we have detected over the last year, actually since the beginning of March, towards remote connectivity protocols and VPN solutions. With the global pandemic, a lot of organizations and countries have forced their people to go into lockdown, resulting in organizations need to improvise remote access to their employees to access data and applications. This is often happening in a very fast, organized, but insecure way, exposing a lot of vulnerabilities. A second example of current affairs is actually where we see that a lot of false information and phishing attempts are being sent out by abusing actually the global pandemic. We see a lot of mails impersonating related organizations, such as the World Health Organization or even the European Commission. The last one even stated a clear warning on their website and trying to launch a campaign to inform as many organizations that they need to share the awareness and the information to the employees to be very cautious with these types of false information. Now, at Orange, we monitor a lot of security devices, endpoints, and networks for our customers. And we see a lot of the attacks that is coming on the news. We see these kinds of attacks with our own eyes in our statistics. We have a continuous stream of data coming from our customers that are being managed by our security operations centers and network operations centers. As we have done in our annual security report from last year, we have extracted some numbers from them and to get a better understanding of the threat landscape over the last year. To make it clear, we generated about 263,000 security events, which led to an actual 22,000 security incidents in 2019. A security event is an observable occurrence that is relevant to either a network activity or an application. This can include both an attempt of an attack or an exposed security vulnerability. While a security incident is actually a confirmed event which resulted in actual damage or an exposed risk to information security assets in the operations. Among some of the incidents that we have detected, recorded the largest amount of network application anomalies. This actually increased over the last year, and these kinds of attacks include tunneled connection attempts, detections by IDS, IPS, systems, but also other attacks related to network protocols and applications. The second largest is the account anomalies. These include brute force attacks, reused credentials, lateral movement within the network to unauthorized systems, or perhaps the elevation of privileges to certain applications. Third one is obviously malware. And like we said before, there is a decrease, but still the monetization has been increased. But the fourth one is system anomalies, which can be related to more operating systems of devices and the devices itself. It can be, for example, a driver that stopped working or important services that abruptly were terminated and unexpectedly. Policy violations take a smaller portion. These can be related to unauthorized software being used or unauthorized devices that are being connected to the network. The least amount are the social engineering attacks, since they are simply the most difficult to detect. These include attempts of fraud, account takeovers, and basically also the phishing attacks. Now, if we put these numbers and classify them in the sizes of the organizations, we can still see that the largest companies are still the most targeted. There is actually a decrease since 2018, where they took about 73% of the attacks, where last year they only take up about 60%. However, when we look deeper into the number of attacks per employee ratio, we can see that small organizations are actually much more exposed than the medium and larger ones. To clarify, small organizations are, by the statistics, companies that have 1,000 or fewer employees, which should account for most organizations in Belgium. Since they deal with far more attacks per employee, that means that they have a very larger workload in handling, managing, and investigating all these events, and they can actually better partner or rely on a third-party expert to assist them with them in handling these kind of security events.
Thanks a lot, Aubrey. I think you clearly set the scene. The challenge is there. There is a rising. The number of cyber threats is clearly rising, both for large companies as also for smaller companies. Now, we come more to the core of this webinar. It's about how can you now deal with these threats, and therefore there is the risk identification process that Thomas will elaborate on.
Yeah, thank you, Koen. So as you understood from Aubrey, you see that the threat landscape is very fast-moving, very innovative, really capable to attack your organization in different ways. So it's very complex for you to know what are your vulnerabilities, where the strikes can come or has the most chance to come from. So here we position the risk identification as a first step to define your risk-based strategy. It looks like an evidence for, I guess, most of you, but it's not that easy in the real life. And we see two reasons why it's not that easy to manage your security strategy. in a risk-based approach. The first one is that we observe too much spending on the wrong things. It means that people and companies are investing in security protection based on fear, but maybe those security protections are not responding correctly to a real vulnerability or risk exposure that your company is suffering. The second reason is that we see more and more security integrating as part of the executive committee of the top management from most of the organization. And if we take the example of the CISO, those are people that are in charge of overseeing and managing the security and bring the information to top management level for them to be able to adapt their decision. But we also see that the CISO are constrained by the top management decision makers, let's say. And they are constrained with new KPI that are not related to the security and the operational security. And we can take, for example, the profitability, the return on investment, and this brings new constraints to the IT security management and the CISO daily task by providing some visibility to the top management over KPI that are not really related to the operational security, and that can make risk identification investments maybe more complex for them to justify towards their top management colleague. But in the meantime, we see on the following slides that the risk identification is part of most of the security framework. And if we take the example of the NIST framework, for example, we see that the identify function is a first step toward a complete process and up to recovery. And as part of this NIST framework, we see within the identify function, most of the categories are related to the governance, are related to the risk assessment, technical risk, or strategic risk. And this is a framework that has been a source of inspiration for Orange Group to develop its security portfolio that you can see on the next slides, that is composed of 5 main product categories that are very similar to the NIST framework. The first one is the prepare, that is rebranded instead of the identify, that provide some solutions in order for the clients to be able to identify the risk they are exposed to and to prepare themselves toward those risks. The second category is to defend. As soon as you have a clear view on the risk exposure, you can decide to invest or to reinforce some of your security layers. The third one is the detect, which become more and more critical. As Aubrey mentioned before, there is a lot of chance that a hacker will enter your company. So one of the challenge our clients and most of the companies are facing at the moment is the capacity to detect when an incident occurs and to react to it. So those third and fourth category, detect and react, are here to support our clients into those two challenges. And the last one is the anticipation, which is inspired from the recovery as part of the NIST framework. That is mainly focusing on employees with awareness development and exercise, because that can really be a plus for you to have some employees aware of the cybersecurity risk and able to react in case of an event is happening. And the last one is more related to threat intelligence, the digital footprint that consists of being aware when your brand name or your domain name can be at risk from, for example, a dark web perspective, thanks to continuous watch. So that's for the introduction regarding the risk introduction, and I think that Aubrey will manage the explanation of each package, each category.
Thank you, Thomas. So let's dig a little deeper into these 5 different phases, starting off with the prepare phase. This part we actually try to develop and to get a better understanding of the organization and how to manage their cybersecurity risk to their systems, assets, data, and other capabilities. If we get a better understanding of the complete business context, we can identify the resources that support critical functions within an organization and their related tasks. This enables an organization to focus and prioritize its efforts in increasing their actual security. This also allows to create a consistent risk management strategy, which is in line with the actual business needs of the organization. Some example outcomes of performing a preparation phase is to define a risk mitigation roadmap, which can prioritize patching and adapt some protection solutions such as a firewall and email security. To give you an example, we had a customer which had a good security maturity level, but was aware of some of its limitations and flaws and wanted to address it. So the customer had about 1,000 employees across around multiple sites in Belgium. Now, their IT department had a lot to manage with their daily operations, but they had the lack of actual security expertise. So we were instructed by the CISO to actually perform a security assessment and get a better understanding over its information security management systems and possible improvement points. Now, according to the ISO 27001 standards, the customer was audited and on their ISMS and issued a report highlighting that there was a large gap between what were the CISO's ambitions and what we actually observed at the company. So after the SEP, they also instructed us to perform a risk impact assessment to prioritize some actions, which was proposed actually in the risk mitigation roadmap. So another way of approaching risk identification is to do some penetration testing. This can be performed either from an internal, external, or application context. It addresses the more technical vulnerabilities, and it can be very extrusive, but it can be expose some existing vulnerabilities within the network. Now, continuous risk identification is also possible by actually doing the vulnerability scanning on a periodic basis. Now, in the next phase, which is the defend phase, we actually want to develop and implement some appropriate safeguards. This ensures that the critical infrastructure services can keep running in case of an incident. This phase should support the ability to limit or contain the impact of a potential cybersecurity incident as much as possible. Some examples or actions during this phase can be hardening the network by implementing a modern email security solution, a next-generation firewall, a strong endpoint protection, network authentication, or a sandbox. Maybe an example we can share, again related to the COVID-19 situation, is that remote working, as we know, is massively deployed by companies, but not everybody was actually prepared to organize it on a very large scale. Remote employees need access to company data and applications from their homes and might potentially use insecure devices, such as personal computers, mobile phones, or tablets. These devices are a potential hazard. They can be infected or unpatched, exposing a great risk to the connected company network. We can actually strengthen that by deploying either a strong endpoint protection solution or enforcing network authentication checks to make sure a health check is performed for each device to connect before actually granting access to the company data. While defending is not sufficient, it's very important to also detect any possible anomaly in the network. This is actually where we try to get as much insight of any possible threat that can slip through the network. It's very important at this point to understand and realize that threats can no longer be stopped completely at the gates. At some point, most companies will have some form of a threat or an attack slipping through, and at that point, it's very important to gain visibility and detect it. Also prepare how you can remediate if such a detection occurs, which we speak about in the next phase. During this phase, we will configure all our solutions in place to generate as much events and data as possible, and we will try to collect that in a central log collection so it can either be accessed and investigated by the security teams or other automated solutions. From all these events, you should use the correct tools and services to correlate as much data as possible. So you only have to look at the events that are really relevant or can cause a potential threat. This can be done, for example, by using a SIM solution or by implementing third-party threat intelligence to your security applications. More and more solutions also offer EDR or endpoint detection and response capabilities. There is a small difference between this and an endpoint protection solution, since an EDR can give you an insight over the complete network in case a dangerous file or activity has been observed, while an endpoint protection is mainly made to secure one single device. According to the statistics we observed at Orange, where we saw the small companies that have a lot of incidents per employees, about 30, we see that this highlights a few things. They have to deal with far more data and possible false positives with actually a very limited amount of resources. Therefore, it might make sense to outsource the analytics of these security events to either a third-party service or a third-party provider, which can be using a SIEM solution or other automated remediation tools. By using a cyber SOC, these kind of events can be analyzed 24/7 by a team of trained professionals. Now, detecting is one thing. We should be able as well to respond to them. For any identified attack, we actually observe within the perimeter. At this point, we want to do for every threat we observe some forensical investigation. This investigation is very important because it will depend very heavily on all the data we collected in the previous steps, and it will clarify what actually happened and what the potential impact will be of the actual attack. We want to establish an incident timeline, analyze the attacker's operation mode, and see if any privilege escalations have been occurred or any horizontal movement within the network, or if actual data has been stolen, copied, or destroyed. Responding to these events can happen in different ways. Do we want to preserve some forensical data, which we need to send to certain authorities? Can we do the remediation automated, or will this require a lot of manual actions? Also, the recovery point might bring in some concerns. Perhaps there are some legal obligations we need to apply to, or we need to inform some related associates about the breach that happened within the network. These kinds of phase require some good coordination and planning just in case an event like this occurs. With all the lessons learned, we will actually try to harden the network and try to prevent the kind of similar attacks by adapting our security solutions and strategy. This can be a very demanding process, and it might make sense to actually hand this out to third-party experts to either address the configuration or perform analytics on the collected data. Some organizations like the CERTS can assist with that. Then to SAP to the future, this is where we want to make the organization more resilient by increasing the employee awareness. This can be performed by doing some user awareness training, since we know that the human is still the weakest link within the organization, and the ability for them to detect a potential threat and how to respond to it can be very key to our organization in these days. Since the majority of email security solutions are not always detecting any possible phishing attempts, it can be a real danger, since we know that most kind of attacks related to ransomware, phishing, and fraud are still transmitted simply by emails. Now, also the security teams, they need some intelligence as well. And there you can actually subscribe to threat intelligence to gain information about the latest threats and trends in attacks, and also malicious domains or potential information related to the geographical location of the organization. Not only the technical teams can be informed, there is also strategic threat intelligence available, which can be really interesting for both decision makers at the company and other executives.
Thanks a lot, Aubrey. Before passing to the next point, the risk identification according to the maturity of your security strategy, I just want to remember you that you can ask your questions or give your remarks via the chat. We see some questions coming in that I will ask after this presentation. So don't hesitate. And then I give the floor to Thomas, who will go much more into in the concrete application of the risk identification exercise.
Thank you, Koen. So I think that Aubrey made a very good review of the risk identification role within the security strategy and the different categories of activity that you have to undertake as a security manager. At the beginning, it's important to know that the risk identification will help you to define the appropriate strategy, but it's also very helpful when you need to detect or react to security incidents. So risk identification is very central, and I hope that you got this point from the Aubrey presentation. From these statements, we try to define some security posture that are depending on the different maturity levels that you can have as an organization to IT security. This is quite subjective, but at least it gives some insights about the way to approach the security. And we identified 4 categories. The first categories are the leaders. The leaders are the people who have a security program running that has been done based on the risk identification, very clear control over the risk exposure. And their main focus is now to following up their technology deployment, their international or commercial development, and the new threat landscape. The second categories are the greenfields. Greenfield are companies with quite low maturity level into IT security. They know that they are exposed to some risk. They lack of confidence in their security strategy. But the main problem for the greenfield is that they don't know how to start. But they really believe that they have to do something. The third categories are the most common companies, that are companies who perform risk identification, at least the minimum viable to identify the main risk. They decided to invest into security solutions to defend themselves according to the risk that they identified, but they don't have operational model afterwards to detect and react to security events. On top of it, we also see that they sometimes underestimate the anticipation category, and especially the employee aspect of this anticipation category. And the last one are the early adopters. Most of the time, the early adopters have performed a risk identification with good control over the risk exposure. They have already an operational model in place, but despite the investment that they have done to protect and to monitor their security, and they are not very satisfied with the return on investment it brings to their business. And it's true that for early adopters, they are confronted to a main challenge, which is the operational management of security, which requires a specific organization with specific resource, specific assets, and that has a strong impact also on the management of the security team. If we see the link we do on the next slide between the security posture and the risk identification, that's also very subjective, but at least it aims to give you some ideas. We see that for leaders, the main challenge is to identify the risk related to their development. Their development can be technology deployment. We can imagine a cloud migration, for example. It can be also the deployment of new equipments. It can also be linked to their geographical development, new countries, new offices in the same country, or it can also be linked to the employee turnover. All these are areas of development that can have a strong impact on their security strategy. What we will suggest to leaders, and that's the way we are mainly working with the big companies that are clients of us, is to perform, for example, penetration testing that are following their development areas that can be either done internally, like if you were an employee, would you be able to extract data? What type of data? From an external perspective, if you are an hacker that is external to your perimeter, how can you enter this perimeter? Or from an application perspective. Another suggestion that we do to leaders to perform some risk identification is to manage some vulnerability scanning. Vulnerability scanning is to help you to prioritize the patching workload. It can be done either on one shot, or it can be done on a regular basis. That can be monthly, quarterly, or whatever you want and whatever is adapted to your position. Another type of solution that we will suggest to leaders is to perform some ISMS audits, but in that case, we will suggest to focus on very advanced aspects. Advanced aspect, what can it be? It can either be, for example, the human resource policies to make sure that your employees are binded by your legal contract, or a third-party management that can be a supplier that has access to some of your IT resources. And it's also important for you to make sure that they are binded contractually and legally speaking, and that those third parties have also a limited access to your resources. So it's also related to the identity and access management. If we now take the greenfields, we understand that the main challenge for the greenfield companies is to define a risk-based strategy, because they know that there is a risk, but they don't know where it comes from. So what we will suggest to greenfields is to start with an ISMS audit to identify their risk exposure, to identify their maturity, and to define a risk mitigation roadmap to implement afterwards in order to improve their posture. Another type of solution that we can provide to Greenfield and that can be subscribed by Greenfield are penetration testing. We will suggest to make it once the roadmap is implemented, but it can also be done from an external perspective straight away to see, okay, what are the vulnerabilities, what are the configuration rules that I need to change now? So those penetration testing and ISMS audit can be performed at the same time in parallel. And then we gathered the most common and the early adopters into the same categories, because according to us, their main challenge is quite similar. We believe that they are quite comfortable with the preparation and the defense phase, but their main challenge is more related to the operational management of their security, meaning the defend and the detect function. And with a good view over their risk exposure, they will be able to implement some KPI that are adapted to their situation and risk exposure, and they will also be able to prepare a good response plan in case of security incident happening into their network, because they are well aware of the risk exposure, so it won't be a surprise. It's important to know that most of the security incidents happen on known vulnerabilities. So it also gives you some insights regarding this risk identification and the importance to perform it. For the most common and the early adopters, we also suggest to perform the penetration testing and the ISMS audit, focusing on the more advanced aspect. But in the meantime, we are all aware at Orange that risk identification is not that easy. We can also perceive it as a theoretical aspects, and that our clients are often mentioning some constraints that are limiting them and limiting their capacity to complete a good risk identification. As part of the first constraints is question of focus. It's true that you sometimes have to choose your battle, and it's true that sometimes the IT roadmap and the IT security roadmap doesn't include this risk identification exercise. Even if it doesn't represent a huge investment, sometimes companies have to follow their vision and their roadmap. The second constraint is a budget constraint. As I said, even if performing an ISMS audit and a penetration testing is not a huge budget, it can sometimes be also constraining for companies to require additional budget that was not forecasted. Some companies don't feel concerned by the risk. It still happens, even if we see that the cyber attacks are striking closer and closer. We still see some clients that don't feel really concerned by the cyber risk, and they don't understand why hackers will target their companies. The fourth one is the skill shortage. That's a market trends. We know that security experts and security specialists are very rare on the market. When you have them on board, sometimes they are very busy, and they might not be available to manage risk identification for your organization, because they might focus on the operational management, for example, and so on. And it is also linked to timing constraint. And the last one is the lack of methodology. It's also a constraint for organization. We are not used to manage such exercise. As a concrete example, with the security assessment, what we do at Orange, we have some certified consultants that are ISO 27001 certified, and they have a real methodology to perform this security assessment. They can perform it step by step with very clear process, and that also allows us to deliver it in very short time. When you have to perform it on your own, when you don't have methodology in place, it can take a lot more, and that can have a very strong impact also on your daily operations and the priorities as part of the IT security roadmap. That was all for me. I hope it was clear. I will give the floor to Koen.
Thanks a lot, Thomas, and also Aubrey. That was a lot of information, a lot of expertise that you shared. I'm happy to see, Thomas, that even in quarantine you're still able to share a lot of expertise. It was a lot from us, but now look at the questions that came in, and I suggest that both of you can share your view on these questions. I'll take one here. Is a question of a participant who demands what is the most important if we look at on one hand security assessment and on the other hand penetration testing. Maybe Thomas, can you share your view on that?
Yes, sure. It's a very good question. I think it's important to see that security assessments and penetration testing are not addressing the same risk. If we go on the security assessment, we will much more focus on the policy, on the governance, on the security controls that are in place. While with the penetration testing, we will go much more into the technical security. We will much more analyze what are the vulnerabilities as part of, for example, the firewall configurations that is blocking attackers to enter the perimeter. So I would say they are very complementary, but I will let Aubrey complete this explanation if needed.
Yeah, I agree with you. They don't replace each other. They should actually be complementary on each other, where the assessment is more looking at the data and the procedures, and the pen testing is far more extrusive, depending on the customer needs. And then, yeah, like I said before, it can be launched from inside the network, from external attacks, or just focusing on some certain applications within an organization. So two different kinds of aspects.
Okay, that's very clear. Maybe another question. I think it's quite relevant. So someone that indicates that he sees the importance of this methodology, so the risk identification exercise, but he wonders, we are confronted to an urgent necessity to protect our perimeter. So how should he or she proceed? Can I, maybe Aubrey, you can tackle this one?
Yeah, I think that some quick wins can be achieved by starting to implement modern and next generation solutions, such as a strong endpoint protection and very recent firewall technology. These don't form any risk in implementing them, and these will actually be the base or the foundation in actually upscaling the overall security towards the future. I'm not sure if Thomas has anything to add to that.
No, I fully agree with you, Aubrey. I think it's a combination of both. You cannot put every investment to protect your assets on hold while you perform risk assessments. You have some very important layers that you need to have as a mandatory security layer. I say the next-gen firewall. I think the email protection can also be perceived as one. The endpoint protection. So that's not taking risk to invest in those layers. And maybe the risk identification will help you to fine-tune the configuration and the rules that you have in place on those security equipment and layers.
Okay. Given the time, I think we can take one last question. It's a classic one. Am I guaranteed to be safe if I perform the complete risk identification procedure? So, Thomas, can you guarantee complete safetiness?
That's a good question. We all know that at the moment, it's impossible to believe that the cyber attacker, the cyber criminals won't enter your company. If they want to, if you are a target for them, there is a lot of chance that they will succeed. It's unfortunate, but it's the reality, I would say. So we see also that more and more the importance is focusing on the capacity to detect and to react to a security incident. But what we believe clearly here is that the risk identification will allow you to make the job of cyber criminals more complex. If you identify and you have a good control over your risk exposure, you will put the good policy, the good rules in place to make their entrance into your IT perimeter more complex. But also, be able to react more quickly and maybe more aggressively when a cyber criminals will be into your perimeter. So risk identification won't guarantee you that it won't happen, but it will definitely help you first to make it more complex, and secondly, to be able to react and limit the damage. That's definitely the way I perceive it. I don't know if Aubrey has another opinion on this one.
No different opinion. I can only highlight the importance of the detection and response capabilities. More and more solutions and vendors of solutions offer EDR capabilities, allowing you to actually investigate any missed threats and attacks inside your network, and often include also the tools to remediate them. So investing in one of these solutions or looking for expertise in these kinds of territories will help you not cover 100%, but brings you more closer to it.
Okay, thank you both. I think it's time to conclude for today. We've seen a lot of interesting trends and methodologies to help you, clients, corporates, in tackling their cyber threat challenges. Let me phrase it like that. We are there to discuss with you much more into detail your specific situation. So don't hesitate to reach out. You can do that directly to us, I think Thomas and Aubrey especially, or to your Orange contact person. I want to conclude by thanking the two experts here. Aubrey, thank you very much for your expertise and to make the travel from Sint-Truiden all the way to the red zone of Brussels. That's quite courage that you have. And Thomas, thank you a lot for the flexibility to join today via Skype call. That was a last-minute change, and you did that in a very good way. I also want to thank my colleague Brikena for organizing this webinar. It's a new setting for us, but it all turned out very professionally organized, I think. And then finally, of course, you, the participants. We have a lot of attendees today. Thank you a lot for listening, and I really hope to see you soon in one of our next webinars. So you can see on this web link the upcoming webinars, and soon you will be able to register, or in a Skype call or another collaboration tool for a more in-depth individual approach. Thank you a lot.